Well, for more on how budget airlines are doing around the world, I'm joined by Mark Weiss, Director of International Operations at Reagan AeroTech. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
So let's obviously start with the Lion Air tragedy in Indonesia. We saw that Boeing and the Federal Aviation Authority raised statements about the airworthiness of the 737. What issues does this incident raise?
Well, it's really interesting because when you have an aircraft like the 737, which basically has been around for over 30 years, the basic airframe has. This is a newer version of it. This apparently was a flaw in one of these systems that prevented the aircraft from operating properly in a takeoff mode and a climbing mode. It got misinterpretation of airspeed from the captain's side to the first officer's side. And so the airplane thought that the aircraft was what they call going to stall, which means there's not enough lift on the wings to keep the airplane flying. And the airplane typically has something called a stick shaker, and it pushes the nose forward. And for whatever reason, and this is to be determined, that was probably what had failed on the aircraft. Now think about this. That airplane was only at a little over 5,000 feet. There's not a lot of time to recover, and that aircraft was going down into the ground at over 600 miles an hour. So this is a very big issue because it's Boeing. And people think of the name of Boeing as reliable, dependable. The airplane's been out there forever. What could go wrong? Why would this happen? And what's really important, and how this also impacts on Chinese aviation, is over 40% of Boeing's 737 aircraft that are to be built are going to Chinese carriers.
So certainly huge implications.
An enormous amount of implication for Chinese carriers and other carriers around the globe.
Now, we know that this has put budget airlines in the spotlight. For people who aren't familiar, what classifies a budget airline from, say, your other bigger traditional airlines? Well,
you know, you have carriers, and let's talk about the United States for the moment. You have carriers, legacy carriers. American Airlines, Delta Airlines, United Airlines, those are legacy carriers that have a long tradition. The budget carriers are those that have come along over the years that have charged lower fares, give you fewer amenities, but they do fly, for the most part, new equipment and train the same way and have the same safety standards. Where they cut their costs are those airplanes fly a lot more hours a day. Their turnaround times on the ground are much shorter. Typically at American Airlines or United, you might be on the ground for an hour or 2 hours an airplane. These airlines will be on the ground for 30 to 45 minutes. If you keep in mind the fact that an airline is a business with wings, it doesn't make money when that airplane is sitting on the ground. So the faster you can turn that around, the more people you can get on it, you keep going to more destinations. And the other thing that sets these airlines apart, too, is of the level of service, the cost for other amenities on board, but the fact that they obviously charge less, right, but they go to secondary airports most of the time. You're not necessarily going to find them flying into major airports. They'll fly into secondary airports with landing fees that are less expensive, or if they fly into major airports, they'll fly at off-peak hours, so the landing fees are less.
Now, this might be particularly applicable when it comes to the Asia-Pacific region, which is expected to have the fastest growth in terms of travel. What sort of opportunities and even challenges might that present?
Well, quite a number, in many ways. Number one, there's been a shortage of pilots, which means that there's going to be a shortage of qualified mechanics globally. I mean, even today, you have mixed language cockpits, which poses an issue. So that's one problem that you have. Getting the aircraft itself. A lot of the budget carriers are flying newer aircraft. The Lion Air airplane that went down had only 800 hours on it, and it was only in service since this past August. Newer airplanes are more fuel efficient. Larger carriers are recognizing that they have to compete. But because of the proliferation, and you saw it in your last segment, the numbers of passengers that are going to be flying in Asia is just exponential. It's incredible. Approximately 4 to 5% of the Chinese population have passports. Your president, Xi, has said that he wants to expand that number in the next few years to 12 to 15%, which is going to mean another 150 million people just in the Chinese market. And that doesn't include what you have in Indonesia and Vietnam and the other areas in Southeast Asia.
Certainly a lot at stake for the global aviation industry. Thank you. Always good to have you on. That was Mark Weiss there, joining us, Director of International Operations at Reagan AeroTech.